Welcome back to Educational Planning. Today we're going to go over Chapter 2, which starts our Module 2 lesson plans about college survival. Let's jump right in. Before we get into it, let's review some of the elements of your forthcoming Map It Out assignment. Remember that details concerning your Map It Out assignment are already available online in our Canvas section. And the main thrust or purpose of this assignment is to develop degree and coursework plan for your tenure here at Rose State. So here's just a few list items that you should consider as you prepare for your submission. Number 1, try to obtain a copy of your degree sheet from your academic advisor or the college catalog. List all courses that are required according to that catalog, including both program requirements and general education classes. Your list should contain at least 20 classes of 3 to 4 credit hours each. In other words, you should be north of 62 credit hours by the time you complete your certificate or degree program. Then, develop a plan for completing your degree program by listing your projected classes and its schedule for the next several terms. And answer the following questions. What is the name of your degree program? What type of associate degree or certificate will you receive? And how many total credit hours are required? You also might consider things like whether or not you're planning to transfer to a 4-year institution or go right into the workplace, and you'll need to answer all of those questions appropriately. That way, you'll be able to complete all aspects of the assignment. Just a few tips in case you're already working on this. You can go to rose.edu. As you can see, it's underlined there at the top, which means you can either take a screenshot or you can jot down this information in your notes. You can go to rose.edu/content/academics/degree-programs/ to see an overview of all of the Associate in Arts and the Associate in Science degree programs, just in case you're not able to get into your advisor within the next 5 to 7 days. Program requirements for a major leading toward an associate degree are each set by the appropriate division, and these requirements are shown in the Rose State College catalog. Let's look at an example of that. Once you open up a degree audit at the degree program website, you'll see something to this effect, which lists literally all of the courses that you'll need to take based upon a degree in criminal justice option or any option that you choose, whether it's for an AA, NAS, or some conglomerate of the two. In other words, there are resources online that will help you complete this assignment and help you curate it to your own needs and schedules. Of course, if you have any other questions, you can reach out to me via email. I'm looking forward to seeing what your degree options prove. In the meantime, folks, we're going to start today's lecture and today's module by learning a little bit about note-taking. Take a careful look at these notes. Do they make sense to you? If not, why? What does this person decide to emphasize? What do you think the most important topics or ideas in the lecture that they were recording were? If you're not able to answer both of those questions in an affirmative way and in a decisive way, then chances are this is a person that might need some more formal training in how to take notes in a college course. So, whether you've been a veteran college student or whether this is one of your first terms in any higher education environment, we're going to spend some time today learning some tricks of the trade regarding taking notes, studying, and learning in a higher education field. This, believe it or not, are some of the notes that were taken by a teenager that got a perfect score on one of the world's most difficult college entrance exams. As Casey Bassett says in her article, last weekend students across Japan took the center test, a scholastic aptitude examination that functions as a key part of the admissions criteria for many Japanese universities, much like the American SAT. The center test is an intensive and extensive examination because it wouldn't be much use in determining applicant comparative knowledge levels if it were easy to ace. An instructor with online test prep provider Manabe Aid recently shared photographs of the study materials of a student who got a perfect score on the world history section. The heavily annotated tome started out as a copy of publisher Toshin's World History edition of its Chiema Ito series. But the dedicated student realized it's not enough to just passively leaf through a textbook. To really acquire knowledge, you have to turn it over in your head, pondering what is and what isn't naturally intuitive to how your individual mind works, and to take notes and add additional information to ensure you truly understand and can retain the material. So in essence, there's a prognosis and a proclamation here that I think we can all take to heart, even if the notes that we see on this corresponding page don't make much sense to us, and not just because they're in a different language. The process of note-taking should always be a process of taking ownership of knowledge, of putting things in your own words, on your own terms. That way you can access that knowledge when you need it the most later on. So with that in mind, here are just a few reasons why you need to learn how to take notes in class. Number 1, instructors frequently will share information outside of their textbooks. Adjunct instructors, especially that teach classes on multiple campuses. In other words, if you have, for example, an English composition instructor and they teach English composition at several metro area community colleges, chances are, just as it says in the brackets, they've been teaching English for 20 years at more than 8 schools, and they probably have a curriculum that's a little bit different or perhaps dramatically different than merely that information shared in your textbook. Perhaps they're curated learning objectives, or if you've ever heard an instructor say, remember, we'll be placing special emphasis on the Civil War this term. That may be because the instructor that you are engaging with has special knowledge about a particular area of your particular topic or subject. In other words, they'll be emphasizing that because they'll be able to share with you information you're not likely to encounter in an overview textbook. And recent innovations and procedures. We've made quite a few developments in the athletic exchange for this process. In other words, if you're a part of a dynamic field of study, especially STEM-based learning, chances are the proverbial wheel is reinvented periodically within that discipline, which means that it doesn't take much for textbooks to become quite out of date. So learning how to take careful notes will not only better prepare you for major assignments such as examinations, but also make you a cut above of your competition in your workplace or field. So how then should you go about taking notes? Well, remember, the purpose of note-taking is to apprehend, understand, and take ownership of knowledge. That means creating a filing system, providing a storehouse for multiple uses, whether it's compositions, exams, or study projects. It should permit you to restructure the information and allow foundation for future consultation and clarification. To use a quotation, active listening, or the thought process of listening for a particular purpose. Active listening implies fully concentrating on what is being said rather than just passively hearing the message of the speaker. Active listening insinuates a response, and as you might expect, involves listening with all your senses. Another reason why you want to have accurate notes that you can easily understand is because of something called the forgetting curve. In other words, within 7 days after encountering material in a course, chances are you'll only be able to retain about 15%, or at least less than 20% of the total knowledge. That's why careful notes will help refresh your memory, since typically we only have a handful of exams each term to quantify your knowledge and your understanding of course materials. So, what are some strategies that you can undertake as you prepare and refine your techniques in note-taking? Number 1, before each lecture, review previous lecture notes, and then devise questions or clarifications for the instructor that you can address at the beginning of the class, and carefully prepare your note-taking materials. It might sound mundane to make sure you have an extra pencil or plenty of paper, but those things really can make a difference, and if you're prepared for each class period, it can reduce your overall apprehension. During the lecture, clarify correlations and relationships with previous materials. If you anticipate a particular question or project around certain keywords or ideas, then start to synthesize those ideas by asking your instructor about them during class itself. and then try to discern the preferences in things like conflicting statistics, or in the things that your instructor might say versus the things that your course textbook might say. Finally, focus on the meaning and message rather than just the grammar and syntax. Again, try to put things in your own words. That way they'll be more digestible and understandable at a later date. Speaking of a later date, after the lecture, you need to try to coordinate your notes. It's never a bad idea to find what's called a study buddy within the first few weeks of class. Share any information that you feel safe sharing with that person in regards to your contact, such as your campus email. That way you can consult with this person before important clutch moments during the term, including exams, compositions, or major projects, and then review materials and summarize those materials so that you can glean the overall meaning of those notes. If you have difficulty with a particular part of the lecture in recalling it or understanding it, try to read them aloud to glean the main points or the overall summary of those particular pieces of information.
What is the best system for taking notes in class? Well, luckily for you, I did the research, and it turns out that there are 5 different note-taking systems that are generally accepted to be pretty darn good. And, of course, I will be representing these note-taking systems with Street Fighter characters, because why not? So, the 5 note-taking systems I'm going to go over in this video include the outline method, the Cornell method, the mind map method, the flow method, and the write on the slides method. The first note-taking system on my list is the outline method. I've chosen Ryu to represent it because the outline method is straightforward, based on hierarchy, disciplined, and overall very simple. In fact, you couldn't get more simple than the outline method unless you were just straight up writing paragraph notes down, and if you think that's going to be a good note-taking method, well, things are not going to work out for you. So the outline method is a note-taking system that's based on bullet points and hierarchy. Basically, to take outline-style notes, you simply create top-level bullet points of all the main points in the lecture. Then you make lower-level bullet points to fill out all the details. If you're taking outline notes on paper, it's a good idea to either space out your main bullet points or summarize them at the top if your professor goes through them, and then make new bullet points that are more detailed down the line. However, if you're taking these notes on a computer like I always did in a program like Evernote or Byword or another word processor, you can easily go back, add new bullet points, and format things without having to mess up the structure of your document too much. So honestly, for the outline method, I think using a computer is a perfect approach. The second note-taking method on my list is the Cornell method, and I've chosen Chun-Li to represent it because she's got multiple kicks and it's got multiple sections. The Cornell method was developed by Walter Pock back in the 1950s, and it still holds up pretty well today. When you take your notes in the Cornell style, you divide your paper into 3 distinct sections. On the top of your paper, you'll have 2 different columns, the left one being the cue column, and the right one being the note-taking column. And underneath those 2 columns, you add another box for the summary. During class, you use the note-taking column on the right to write notes in a normal style. However, this is where the Cornell method deviates from other note-taking systems. As soon as you can after class, you write down questions or cues in the cue column. These are meant to help you review later. You also write down a summary of the lecture in the summary column. These 2 sections of the Cornell method, the summary and the cue column, they're both designed to help you build reviewable notes the first time you write them. That way you don't have to go back and rework your notes so much. Note-taking system number 3 is the mind map method. You know, it's been said that your mind is a map of the territory that is reality. So maybe by that logic, the mind map system is the perfect note-taking system. Actually, that doesn't make any sense at all. Either way, I chose Dalsim to represent the mind mapping system because he's a meditator and he's always focused on improving his mind. To begin a mind map, you simply take a blank piece of paper, draw a circle in the middle of it, and add the main topic of the lecture there. Then you'll start branching off little trees and adding subtopics. Eventually you'll have lots of little branches and you'll create a mind map. I never actually used mind maps for my class notes, but I have used them for blog post topics before. When I wanted to write a blog post on all the ways you could save money in college, I wanted to make sure I could cover all my bases. So I created a mind map. I put saving money in college in the middle, and then tried to figure out all the different facets of a student's life where they have to spend money. Building a mind map helped me organize all these topics, and as a result, I was able to create a more comprehensive list in the end. The fourth note-taking system is the flow method. This system was invented by the writer Scott Young, who's probably best known for going through the entire MIT computer science curriculum in a single year. Scott uses what he calls holistic learning, and his approach is diametrically opposed to the rigid, transcribing style of the outline method. As a result, I chose Blanca to represent this note-taking system. His fighting style is that of basically a wild animal, and it's the complete opposite of more disciplined fighters like Ryu or Guy. And that is a perfect way to describe the flow system of note-taking. You're not trying to get every single detail from the lecture down onto your paper. And in fact, the point is not to transcribe the lecture at all. Rather, it's to learn while you are sitting in class. As you take your notes, your goal is to create an original document that represents your mental image of the subject. It's not to record verbatim what your professor said. As you take notes, you can go back to earlier points, add details, draw in arrows and little offshoots, and basically create something that is your own. The entire point of the flow system of note-taking is to learn it once. This lets you accelerate your learning, and that's the real strength of the system. Final system of taking notes is the lazy man's way of taking notes. And I call it the write on the slides method. To represent this note-taking method, I chose Zangief. Because Zangief. Seriously, do you really think I put a whole lot of thought into these things? If your professor actually lets you download the lecture slides before class, then it can be pretty convenient to just go print them off the computer lab and write directly on them. One of the cool things about this method is that the slides more or less mirror the flow of the lecture, so you almost get a sort of timeline view when you take notes on slides. It's kind of like SoundCloud, where people can actually leave comments at specific times during an audio file. Taking notes on slides isn't that accurate, but it's pretty close. And when you do it, you can look back and say, okay, at this slide he was talking about return on the cost of buzzwords synergy management. So those are the real strengths of the method. You don't have to write as much because the slides sort of do it for you, and you get a sort of timeline view for your notes. So those are, in my humble opinion, the best 5 note-taking systems out there. Which one's right for you? Hey there!
Alright, folks. Hopefully one of the things that you've learned about note-taking is there are an array or myriad of styles, and sometimes different styles are going to work better for some classes over others. Now, although the video that we looked at described 5 distinct styles, we're only going to concentrate on several for the purposes of our lecture. Number 1 is what's called the lecture notes or slide information, the Zangief style. Here, all you want to do is record all of the notes on one side of your paper, such as you see in the left-hand column of this particular image, and in the right hand you create your own personal notes or questions. At the end, you want to develop your own summary of that material. That way you can synthesize important information. As you might expect, this is good for either historical, chronological, or conceptual thinking, when you do need to distill a lot of information into a few brief utterances for mnemonic reasons. Then there's the T method of taking notes. This is where you divide all of your pages into a T, with main ideas and details and even sub-details. For example, in notes about microorganisms, this person has divided the T of their notes into bacteria, protozoa, and viruses. Now, as you might expect, these particular notes don't have as much detail as the previous slide. So they're good for notes where lots of keywords are an essential ingredient for your overall success in the class, especially courses like foreign languages. And finally, the Cornell notes, which was described in the video that we just watched. And this is probably the most comprehensive and is best reserved for courses in which you don't either have an intuitive understanding of the material or in which you think you're going to have to do a lot of deep critical thinking, and some, if not all, of your worth or value in the course is going to be measured by evaluations from examinations. So here you place cues in the left-hand column. These are either questions, main ideas, or diagrams, essentially a prompt of both the things that we've discussed in the previous 2 slides. Your notes, which is where you record as much of the lecture as you can here, by using shorthand symbols, abbreviations, and concise or brief phrases. Then finally, a summary at the bottom. The best plan for this is to devote 1 Cornell note page to each main concept in a lecture. That way, whenever you review these, you will know that every single summary encompasses one of those main concepts or ideas. So with that in mind, let's look at this. Dan Wax writes in advice for students taking notes. He says the purpose of note-taking is simple: help you study better. This means your notes don't have to contain everything. They have to contain the most important things, and if you're focused on capturing everything, you won't have the spare mental cycles to recognize what's truly important. So in other words, one of the purposes of note-taking is to help you distill or synthesize what's more or less important during a lecture. Your focus while taking notes should be twofold. First, what's new to you? There's no point in writing down facts you already know. If you already know the Declaration of Independence was written and signed in 1776, there's no reason to write that down. Second, what's relevant? What information is most likely to be of use later, or on a test, an essay, or completing a project? Focus on points that directly relate to or illustrate your reading, which means you'll actually have to get done reading the textbook. So with that in mind, how do you know what to write down and not to write down during the lecture? Well, there are a few cues or tricks that you can use to understand what's going to be germane or relevant later on in the course. Number one are verbal transitions and emphasis. Instructors usually pause before or after an important idea. In other words, they're either preparing you to write something down, or they're giving you extra time to write down what they just said. And they tend to introduce important ideas with special phrases, another point to remember, etc. And instructors often use repetition to emphasize important points. Chances are, if an instructor paraphrases or even outright says the same thing more than once, there's a good chance it'll wind up on an exam someday. There are also signal words that are used during the lecture, such as successive main ideas, the three aspects of cellular reproduction, etc., etc., or an indication of the supporting materials. On the other hand, there are conclusions and summaries as a result, and direct points of address, the basic concept here. Whenever you hear things like the basic concept here as a result, there's an outcome that's being implied by the instructor, an outcome that you might have to reverse engineer on a project or composition later on in the semester. Finally, you should review signals after the lecture. Mark ideas that have been emphasized with an arrow or other special symbols. Take down examples which the instructor presents and note them with an EX. And finally, pay close attention to transitional words and phrases, just like that were used in this slide. With that in mind, here's a brief article by Laura Papano on how to take better lecture notes. Groups that reviewed instructor notes performed best. It didn't matter so much that you did during lecture. It mattered what notes you had. Even those who didn't attend the lecture but reviewed instructor notes did better than those who attended and reviewed their own crummy notes. In other words, what Papano is trying to say is that even if you don't attend every lecture, but you carefully review the notes of your study buddy, chances are you'll do overall far better on the course than students that show up to class, just take notes, and then never ever look at them again, even in preparation for an exam. At that point, you're really wasting your time. Or, as he concludes, the real value of note-taking is not so much in the taking as in the having. So, let's change gears for a little bit. How do you clarify material then during the lecture to make sure that what you've written down can be elaborated on and can be reviewed? Number one, try to ask questions in a courteous and positive manner. Could you elaborate on it? Could you clarify? Try to avoid negative phrases, even if you're experiencing frustration. Don't you think? I don't see how. Make relevant statements. It seems to me, I think, perhaps. Notice that those statements imply the person is already taking ownership of what they've encountered in the lecture. And, of course, avoid absolute statements. Everybody knows. Well, the fact is, any idiot could see. You don't want to alienate other students in the classroom, and especially not the instructor or professor, because that sets you apart from a discrete learning community, which is ideally what a classroom should be.
Hey guys, so I've been in college for 1.5 years now, so I think it's safe to say that I'm an expert on all things college. Just kidding, but by now I've taken quite a few classes, so I know that when it comes to professors, it can sometimes be hit or miss. I mean, some professors have been great, others less so, and others seem to defy any type of categorization. Most professors know their stuff and are great researchers, but sometimes their style of teaching isn't exactly the most accessible, to put it diplomatically. So here are the 5 main types of professors I've come across. This type of professor is unfortunately more common than you'd like. They somehow have the ability to make anything remotely interesting uninteresting. So the play Antony is pretty scandalous. It's about a girl who defies authority and dies as a martyr for her personal values. Pretty interesting, you'd think, right? Yeah, but instead of talking about that, let's focus on some things like syntax, grammar, word choice, and my personal favorite, semicolons. Talking about this, not gonna lie, is bringing up trauma for me. Last semester I took a class I was actually really excited about, but the professor was just a hot mess. He'd come to class super late and then would start rambling about anything you could possibly imagine is 100% irrelevant to what we read for class for 4 hours. So the academic study of rhetoric merges fields like communications and law, but that actually reminds me, we had Thanksgiving the other day, right? So come on, tell me what you guys did. I personally had an amazing time. My wife Margaret made this beautiful turkey, which reminds me, this one time I went to this super narrow street in Barcelona, and there was this tiny, cute restaurant there called Kill Me. I have to say this has been my favorite type of professor. Really smart people can be quite eccentric and frankly, super weird. So let's talk about cells, guys! Oh man, I'm so pumped to talk about cells and chromosomes! I thought this was intro to sociology, but dude, I'm psyched for cells, man! I've had the fortune or misfortune, depending on your perspective, to have enrolled in several classes with a professor I'd say is nothing short of a genius. They may be the most quotable person, apart from me obviously, I've ever come across, but with great genius can come great snobbery. Everyone in this professor's eyes is a moron. It's seriously hilarious. This is usually what goes down when someone in class asks a question. Excuse me? I didn't really understand your last point. Are you suggesting that— No! I don't know about you, but I feel like friendship is something that should somehow develop organically. In other words, you shouldn't force someone to be your friend. There's one professor who literally made following them on Twitter a requirement for the class. Something inside me wishes somewhere this is illegal because it definitely feels illegal. Alright students, remember that 20% of your final grade is determined by your midterm results, 20% by your, final exam, and 60% by how often you retweet me. Alright, thanks for watching. What are some interesting or weird episodes you've had with teachers or professors?
Alright folks, so obviously, taking those notes and that video into account, one of the things that you'll need to learn is how to navigate certain professors in your course. One of the most important relationships between an instructor and their lectures is whether you should take notes from your textbook because your instructor might not have the most digestible or understandable note-taking style or lecture style. So, if you are going to take notes on your textbook, here's just a few strategies. Number 1, skim the book and chapter first. By skimming, that means you're looking for emboldened words or phrases to get a general overview about what the taste of that chapter is going to look like. And look for a pattern in the elements of the chapters, including subsection headings, summary points, things like lists, numbers, etc. Then determine if there's an index, a glossary, or a summary that you can use to help navigate your foray into that chapter. If there's a summary, start there. Clue your brain in onto what's important. That way, if you're a little addled because it's late at night or if you've had a long week, you'll at least have some anchors to pay attention to. Then create questions about the words and terms that are emphasized. In lots of textbooks, these are actually in the margins of those particular documents or chapters. They're often paraphrased within bold words. And finally, use symbols for visual reminders and emphasis. Alright, folks, that's all we have for today. Like I said, I hope you have a great time this week as you finish your Map It Out assignment, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about it in the meantime. Stay safe and stay happy.